The Common Clause. It may be the end of open source software as we know it. Plus Microsoft. It accounted for £1 out of every £5 spent in 2017 by British businesses and the public sector. Steam Play adding support for Windows games for Linux may provide a path forward for gaming on the Chromebook, and if you are not using command line aliases, you really should be. It saves you time, makes you more productive. Also, Joplin. It is an open source, encrypted note-taking and to-do application. These are 5 stories that today I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is the Commons Clause. It may be the end of open source software as we know it. What is the Commons Clause? The Commons Clause is this new controversial licensing term that can be added as an addendum to many free and open source licenses out there. The problem with it is that the Commons Clause itself really goes against the principles of both the free software movement and the open source software movement. In a lot of ways, the Commons Clause is really incompatible with the open source criteria or the 4 freedoms for the free software definition. Reading a little bit of an article over here at consortiuminfo.org. This is their standards blog. This article written by Andy Updegrove, and of course I will link to this article and all the articles that I show on the show this evening. The Commons Clause, helpful new tool or the end of open source as we know it. Anyway, reading a little bit of this, almost nothing inspires a spirited discussion among the open source faithful as much as introducing a new open source license, or a major change in an existing license. Yada yada yada. Anyway, the clause itself, speaking of the Commons Clause, is short. You can find it here, and I will actually show you the clause. If you go to commonsclause.com, and I will of course link to that website, you will find the very short Commons Clause version 1.0. I'll read a little bit of it. The software is provided to you by the licensor under the license as defined below, subject to the following condition. Without limiting other conditions in this license, the grant of rights under the license will not include, and the license does not grant to you, the right to sell the software. So, you can do whatever you want with this software, but you cannot sell it, you cannot make money from it, you cannot profit from it in any way. That is what the Commons Clause does to whatever existing license you add this thing to, such as, an Apache license or whatever you want to add it to. Now, some of the controversy behind this is, again, this kind of goes against the 4 freedoms, speaking about free software. It also goes against the criteria set down by the Open Source Initiative as far as what open source software is. I mean, the first criteria, free redistribution. Probably not in compliance with that. Probably also got some issues with their derived works criteria, integrity of the author's source code, maybe some other criteria here that the Commons Clause would be kind of in violation of. And you know what? The Commons Clause guys, the people behind it, they know that the Commons Clause invalidates open source. As a matter of fact, under their FAQ, they have a FAQ. The second question is this open source? And the answer is no. So, quote, open source has a specific definition that was written years ago and is stewarded by the Open Source Initiative, which is that website I just showed you here, that lists the criteria. If you do not meet all of these criteria, you are not open source software. And the Commons Clause, of course, does not meet all that. They know that, so they are saying, yes, we are not, in fact, open source software, at least not as defined by the Open Source Initiative. So applying the Commons Clause to an open source project will mean the source code is available, and that meets many of the elements of the open source definition, such as free access, free to modify, freedom to redistribute, but not all of them. So to avoid confusion, it is best not to call Commons Clause software, quote, open source. So if you add the Commons Clause to an open source license, it is, in fact, no longer an open source project. It is no longer open source software. So going back to the Andy Updegrove article here at the Standards blog, I'll read a little more. The clause itself is short. It was drafted by Heather Meeker, an attorney with long open source involvement, in conjunction with, quote, a group of developers behind many of the world's most popular open source projects, unquote. So Heather Meeker, this attorney behind drafting the Commons Clause, says she did this in conjunction with a group of developers behind some of the world's most popular open source projects. I wonder what those projects are, and I wonder really how popular those projects are. I doubt they're any of the really, really large projects that we, know about, as far as most of us, as far as being aware. When this Commons Clause first came on the scene a few days ago, really what sparked some of the controversy was right away there was an open source bit of software that adopted the Commons Clause. Redis Labs, I don't know anything about this particular software here, but I think they do some kind of networking software. But anyway, they added the Commons Clause to their Apache 2.0 license. Let me see if I can figure out what they do. They do database software. Okay. Anyway, most people have not heard of this particular company or their software, but, they have been doing all this open source software for a long time. And you know what? They're not really able to make money off of it because they realized that, by providing all this open source software, other people were taking their software and making money off of it, modifying it, changing it, selling support for their software, etc., etc. So the free software movement and the open source software movement really does hamper a lot of developers from making money. People that want to support free and open source software, they realize they can't really make a living doing it. So that really kind of was the spark behind this particular new license term, this clause. Anyway, reading a little bit more of the article. It's simple in concept. It gives a developer the right to make sure no one can make money out of her code, whether by selling, hosting, or supporting it, unless the Commons Clause code is a minor part of a larger software product. So basically, again, you can no longer profit from somebody else's work as far as their free and open source work if they add the Commons Clause to it. But that violates, again, the 4 freedoms of free and open source software. It also violates the open source definition as defined by the Open Source Initiative. So that's the first cause of unhappiness. Immediately, a lot of people in the free and open source community jumped all over this thing and said that's no longer free and open source software when you add this clause to it, which technically it's not. They're right. And the Commons Clause guys, they know that. The people behind it basically say, yeah, it's not open source. They're calling this, instead of being open source, they're calling this, quote, source available, meaning the source is still out there. You can look at it, but it's no longer technically open source. It is just source available code. But I think that is whitewashing it a little bit. They really should just call it what it is. It's proprietary. It is no longer, if it's not open source code, it is proprietary code. They're trying to find this gray area, and there is none. This is really white or black, right? So it's either open or it's not. So anyway, adding the Commons Clause to an open source license makes it no longer an open source license. Secondly, if the Commons Clause catches on, and it could give rise to an unwelcome trend, basically, the author here of this article says, what if more and more free and open source projects latch on to the Commons Clause and start adding it to their license? That is the, fear behind this, why the title of this, which is a little bit of fear-mongering, but he's right. You could have, a lot of open source projects now adopt this Commons Clause, and he's right. That would be the end of open source as we know it if a large percentage or even all open source projects, which is ridiculous. We can't get 100% of anybody to agree on anything, especially in the free and open source community. So I doubt the Commons Clause is going to catch on that much, but still, it is disheartening that this thing was drafted and that we've already had one free and open source project adopt it. Anyway, there is some problem with the language of this particular license too, is that it's vague. Some of the language in it, if I go back to the Commons Clause, I read you most of it. The first 2 paragraphs. There is a third paragraph. For purposes of the foregoing, Sell means practicing any or all of the rights granted to you under the license to provide to third parties for fee or other consideration, including without limitation fees for hosting or consulting/support services related to the software, a product or service whose value derives entirely or substantially from the functionality of the software. I know that's kind of a long sentence and kind of convoluted, but anyway, a product or service whose value derives entirely or substantially. Now, substantially, that's a problem. That's kind of vague. What exactly does substantially mean? It's not really a legal term. So, matter of fact, going back to the article here, the word that causes the most concern in the license is substantially. Without a bright line test, it will be impossible to tell when one can and cannot use the code in a commercial product. And note that the test is functionality rather than lines of code. How do we judge functionality? Are some functions more important than other ones? So there's no clear dividing line here. What is substantial and what isn't? That is a problem. Reading a little bit more here, the inclusion of the Commons clause in a software product can also lead to some novel results. For example, someone hosting a free copy of a software product containing a substantial amount of Commons clause software on their own server for their internal use would not be in violation of its terms, but a cloud provider hosting the same software for the same customer would be violating the copyright of the developer. And in either case, a third-party service provider might engage in conduct that violates the license. Anyway, we just, it's this really kind of vague, just this language here with the substantially, that word substantially, is going to cause some problems because really, until lawyers get involved or until there's some lawsuits and, judges and juries actually get involved and stuff like this, I'm not exactly sure how this is going to play out. If you are a proponent, though, of free software and open source software, there is one thing that we can be certain of. The Commons Clause is in violation of those principles, and really it is a bad thing. It is something to be frowned on. Again, if you add the Commons Clause to a free license, your software is no longer free or open source. It is now proprietary. So this is not something that we need to promote. And in fact, it is something that we need to make more people aware of. It's kind of new. There hasn't been a lot of talk about it on the internet, not as much as I would have liked to have seen. That's partly why this is my first story here this evening in this particular episode of Taking Into Account, is because I really don't like seeing things like this. And I think some people are kind of apathetic to things like this. Oh, it's not that big of a deal. It's a small little clause. It really doesn't make that big of a difference for most projects, but it kind of does. When you have principles, when you have ideals, you really can't compromise on them. You really have to stick to them, because if you compromise, let me put it to you this way. If we're way over here and the proprietary guys are way over here, why are we coming into the middle, with something like the Commons Clause? We need to hold fast and make them come to us. Anyway, so that's the first story for this evening. And the second story on the docket tonight is Microsoft. Microsoft accounts for £1 in every £5 spent on software in the UK in 2017 by British businesses and the public sector. So Microsoft had a really good year in the UK in 2017. Actually, Microsoft had a fantastic 2017 worldwide. Microsoft, of course, a very profitable company, very rich company, and they are making bucket loads of money pretty much everywhere, but they are doing really well in the UK. So this article over at the Register, this was written by Richard Speed. £1 in every 5 that UK business and public sector spent on software in 2017 went to, drumroll please, Microsoft. Microsoft accounted for 1 in 5. Anyway, unsurprisingly, it clings to the top spot in the spend rankings as far as business expenditures on software. The research published by Analyst Tech Market View, TMV, revealed a total of £7.35 billion coughed up on enterprise software licensing, maintenance, software as a service in, the last 12 months. Our friends in Redmond, that's of course Microsoft, while still at the top of the charts by a comfortable margin, saw a tiny 0.3% of growth to $1.3 billion. However, the impressive growth of its cloud business in 2018 should make for bigger numbers next year, and of course they reference another article from the Register from last month where they announced, some record-breaking profits from Microsoft. So this was a month ago, back in the middle of July. Microsoft has closed out a massive fiscal 2018 that saw the Redmond giant lay claim to more than $110 billion in total revenue. A lot of this was due to their cloud-based operations. Azure and its cloud compute operation was singled out in Redmond's financial figures released on Thursday, again last month, as one of Microsoft's top performers both in the full year and then in the past 3 months. So they are making bucket loads of money now with Azure and their cloud compute operation. They're really trying to compete more in that space as Microsoft tries to pivot away from the desktop operating system, Windows, and compete more in the cloud space, which really is dominated by the likes of Amazon and increasingly Canonical with Ubuntu. Microsoft, of course, is trying to get in that market, before it is just completely wrapped up by those Linux offerings. Obviously, my preference, of course, would be to have, free and open source software as far, take hold of those markets rather than the likes of Microsoft. But they had a very good 2017 and are having a fantastic 2018 already. Revenues of $30 billion were up 17% from $25 billion in quarter 4 of 2017. So, yeah, these are some impressive gains for their fiscal year here, reading this article. But back to the original article. Again, Microsoft at the top of the charts in the UK as far as business and public sector spending on software. Also, the imminent price hikes or price adjustments aimed at enterprise won't hurt Microsoft profits either, because they are raising their prices now on their software, Microsoft, to make even more profits. They are also planning on going to this subscription model for enterprise, which should make them even more money. Of course, that's assuming that most businesses are willing to pay for that subscription model. We've already seen one example, and this article references Israel, where the Israeli government basically said no to Microsoft. They're not going to pay their higher fees, their subscription model fees, and that they are exploring other software rather than Microsoft software in the future. That unless Microsoft can cut them some kind of deal, which so far Microsoft has not been willing to, Israel is leaving Microsoft behind as far as in the government and business. Second place in the UK was Oracle Software. So it saw a decline, though, in its UK revenues of nearly a full percentage point, down to $1.1 billion, and that is a distant, actually, second from what Microsoft did as far as sales. Rounding out the top 5, SAP, IBM, and Sage in that order. The big loser was 9th place Micro Focus, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, the point of this article and the article that this article referenced was that Microsoft had a big year in the UK. Microsoft is having a really big year everywhere. Again, it's looking to make, over $100 billion just on its cloud computing platform now. So that is a big deal. That should concern those of us that support free and open source software, because that was a market that really we were the major player in, still are, but Microsoft is coming up. They're coming up to meet us on that. So something we need to follow closely. And the third story on the docket tonight is Steam Play adding support for Windows games on Linux. We talked about this in a story last week on episode 5 of Taking Into Account this gigantic news from Valve. They're offering this new service called Steam Play, which adds support for Windows-only games, makes it possible to play those Windows-only games on a Linux device. Because of that, gaming on a Chromebook may be possible in the very near future, so the Chromebook may become a viable gaming platform. Reading an article from Chrome Unboxed. This article is called Chromebook Gaming Around the Corner as Steam Adds Support for Windows Games on Linux. This was written by Robbie Payne. Reading a little bit of this, just yesterday, Gabriel posted an article about 3 Chromebook devices being developed with AMD chipsets and how that entire segment of devices is progressing, yada yada yada. Anyway, he references a previous article on Chrome Unboxed where Chromebooks, 3 new Chromebook devices being released with better chips, better AMD chipsets. Apparently Chromebooks, they're kind of underpowered devices. They always have been because there's not much to a Chromebook. It's kind of a small device, not much to it. Basically all it does is run the Chrome browser. Everything's pretty much browser based on the Chrome OS. So as far as hardware, it's never been, anything to write home about, but increasingly Chromebooks are becoming more and more powerful. They're developing more and more powerful machines that run Chrome OS. So some of these in the future may even include dedicated GPUs, possibly. Anyway, reading a little further, as it turns out, the stars are aligning in a way that GPU support may be a key factor in upcoming Chromebooks, most specifically for gamers. 3 very important things are happening at the same time right now that are laying the foundation for gaming on Chromebooks to become a legitimate, enjoyable activity. Let's talk about them. So, 3 things are aligning that may make gaming on Chromebook possible. The first one he talks about is Linux apps on Chromebooks getting GPU support. Reading ahead, we've talked about this first part, but it's perhaps the most crucial part of the overall puzzle. GPU support is currently not working at all on Linux apps installed on Chromebooks. From what we know right now, we should see the switch flipped sometime in Q4 of 2018. So, GPU support, of course, will be required to do any kind of gaming. Right now, GPU support's not working on Linux apps installed on Chromebooks, but with it by Q4 of 2018, we might see this turned on. So that's just a few months down the road. Point 2 he makes is devices with better GPUs are coming out. So as Gabriel pointed out both yesterday and in another post concerning the Kaby Lake G processor, Chromebooks with discrete graphics cards will eventually be a thing. So that's huge. Instead of using onboard graphics now, Chromebooks with discrete graphics cards will eventually be a thing. And once you have a good, discrete graphics card, an external graphics card of some kind, dedicated graphics, then gaming becomes a very, very real possibility. And of course, the third component of this is the one I was really focused on here was the fact that Steam Play allows Linux machines to run Windows games. Chrome OS is essentially Linux. When you strip it down, underneath it all is the Linux kernel, specifically a Gen 2 Linux kernel. Chrome OS is built on Gen 2. So the last part of the equation comes by way of Steam's announcement this week that Windows games will now be playable on Linux devices. How they are pulling this off is a bit over my head, yada yada yada. Well, I discussed on episode 5 of Taking Into Account last week how Steam Play works. Basically, it's a project they're calling Proton, which uses Wine and some other technology, and basically they use that as a wrapper around these Windows-only games to allow them to be able to run on Linux machines. So, again, Chrome OS is essentially Linux, so better machines, better GPU support, and then Steam Play. The stars are aligning for Chrome OS and Chromebooks to become a viable gaming platform. Speaking of Steam Play, Steam for Linux adds 1,000 perfectly playable Windows games in under a week. 6 days ago, there were less than 5,000 games available to install and play on Steam for Linux. Following Valve's incredible Steam Play update, which adds streamlined compatibility layers for Windows-only games, that number is potentially much, much higher. Anyway, so we already have 1,000 more titles for Steam on Linux than we had a week ago, thanks to Steam Play, and that is an increase of almost 20%, practically overnight, and that number is guaranteed to climb higher as the Linux community continues testing the enormous library of Windows games on their favorite Linux distributions. So as more and more people, go through the Windows gaming catalog on Steam, more and more will be found to be compatible with Steam Play and Steam on Linux, and this number is just going to keep getting higher and higher. We already have over 5,000 games now available for Steam on Linux, if we include Steam Play. So this is gigantic news for obviously us on Linux, but also Mac users and of course Chromebook users. And the fourth story on the docket tonight is Are you using command line aliases? Are you using bash aliases or ZSH aliases? Shell aliases. If you're not, you should be, because it saves you time. It makes you more productive. So this article that I found a couple of days ago over on opensource.com, this was written by author Archit Modi, who works for Red Hat. 15 command line aliases to save you time. So before we get into the article, some of you are probably wondering, what the heck is command line aliases? Well, if I view this image here, this will explain it a little more. Basically, an alias is a shorter way of typing the same command. So you guys, most of you, probably 90% plus of all your Linux distributions out there, the default shell is bash. In your home folder, you have a file called .bashrc. In that file, if you wanted to, you could create aliases for commands you use all the time. For example, in this screenshot here, we have alias egrep. Let me go up here. Alias egrep equals egrep space dash dash color equals auto. You see, because he wants egrep always to have that flag. He never wants to run egrep without that flag, so he creates an alias for egrep so that it always uses this color equals auto flag. Same thing for those of you that use the ls command. I use the ls command all the time at the command prompt. Most of us do. It's the list command where you go to a directory, you type ls to see what files and directories are in that directory. And for me, I always want to run ls space dash L for long format, A for all files including hidden files, and H for human readable numbers. So I alias ls to be ls space dash LAH. That is, an alias that I find useful for me. One that you guys might find useful, you guys that are on Ubuntu-based distributions, sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade. You probably type that command often if you're one of these people that update your system at the command line. Wouldn't it be great to not have to type that rather lengthy sentence out to do that command? You could just create an alias space update equals, and then in quotation marks, sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade. Now you have an alias. Save that in your bash rc file, or if you have a bash aliases file, .bash_aliases file, you can add it there. And at a command prompt, now instead of typing sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade, you can just type the word update. Hit enter, and it runs the exact same command. That is an alias. It is a shorter way to type out lengthier commands, or in some cases where you want your commands to always use the same flags without having to type out all the flags. Or in this case, he's got alias vi equals vim. Yes, I never want to use vi, I want to use vim. So even if, I type the command vi, I want it to actually launch vim. That's a good alias. Yeah, anyway, reading a little bit of his 15 command line aliases to save you time. And I won't focus really too much on what he focuses on, because what he will find as useful for aliases will be different from what I find useful, what you find useful. But if you use the terminal a lot, you use the command line a lot, I'm sure you can think of commands, things you run in the terminal all the time on a daily basis that you can make shorter. You can find a shorter, easier way to type. And how you do that is in your bash rc file or your bash aliases file, you find a new line and type alias space the name of the alias equals without space in quotes command, the name of the command you wish to run. So anyway, some of the ones he finds useful are updating the system. I just told you how you might do that on an Ubuntu-based system. This guy works for Red Hat, so he did it with alias. He created an alias for sudo yum install. And his alias for sudo yum install was just the word install. So all he does is open up a terminal, type the word install, and now that's the same as typing sudo yum install, name a program. So that's a pretty useful one. He also does aliases for sudo yum update, sudo yum upgrade. He aliases sudo su for switching to the root user. He aliases that to the word root. That's pretty neat. I never considered that. He also has aliases for a process, which equals ps space dash aux. Aliases how to restart a system. On a systemd system, restart would be sudo systemctl restart. He aliases that to one word, which is srestart, all one word. He also aliases kill, the word kill, to sudo pkill. So some useful aliases. I thought this was, this is kind of a geekier, kind of nerdier article. It's not for everybody that's going to be watching this particular program right now. Some of you really hate the command line and you never open a terminal for anything. But for those of you that do spend some time in the terminal, you probably use a lot of the same commands over and over and over again. Using aliases to shorten these commands, making them easier to type, easier to remember in some cases, really saves you on time and it makes you more productive. So do consider that. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. Tonight I'm going to feature a free and open source application. This application is called Joplin. Joplin is an encrypted open source note-taking and to-do application. It is, of course, available on Linux, since this is very much Linux-centric, this particular show. But Joplin is also available on Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android. So I'm going to read a little bit from this article written over on linuxuprising.com. The title of this article, Joplin Encrypted Open Source Note-Taking and To-Do Application. Joplin is a free and open source note-taking and to-do application available for Linux, Windows, Mac OS, Android, iOS. Its key features include end-to-end encryption, markdown support, and synchronization via third-party services like Nextcloud, Dropbox, OneDrive, or WebDAV. So with Joplin, you can write your notes in the markdown format with support for math notations and checkboxes, and the desktop app comes with 3 views: markdown code, markdown preview, or both side by side. So if I take a look at this screenshot here, you can see that this particular note-taking app, you have 2 panes here. Again, you have your markdown code and your markdown preview. You see how basically this is the code and this is how it shows up in the preview. Very, very cool. Cross-platform, open source note-taking application. There's a lot of note-taking applications out there, but there are not a lot of good ones, especially for those of us on Linux. Joplin seems like a really nice app. I installed it on my system, played around with it for a little bit. I am not a note-taking or to-do list kind of person, though. I don't use that kind of software, so I'm not the kind of person to give a proper review of something like Joplin, but I did think it was a neat program. I thought it deserved some attention. Reading more from this article from Linux Uprising. The application should handle a large number of notes pretty well by allowing you to organize notes into notebooks, add tags, and search in notes. You can also sort notes by updated date, creation date, or title. Each notebook can contain notes, to-do items, or both, and you can easily add links to other notes. In the desktop app, right-click on the note and select Copy Markdown Link, yada yada yada. Anyway, to-do items in Joplin support alarms, but this feature didn't work for me in Ubuntu 18.04, so I guess the Joplin app was a little buggy in Ubuntu 18.04, at least the alarm feature did not work for the author here. Other Joplin features include an optional web clipper extension for Firefox and Chrome, optional command line client. So other than the GUI note-taking application, Joplin does have a command line interface, so that is pretty cool. That would be useful for somebody like me, since I do a lot of stuff in a terminal. I use a lot of tiling window managers, so I would probably just use the Joplin command line interface for a quick note-taking app for me. But the GUI, of course, is what most people would be interested in. You can import Enex files, Evernote export format. You can export JEX files, which is the Joplin export format, PDF and RAW files. Geolocation support, yada yada yada. Anyway, while it doesn't offer as many features as Evernote, Joplin is a robust open source Evernote alternative. Joplin includes all the basic features, and on top of that, it's open source software. It includes encryption support. So I actually installed Joplin. So Joplin, full disclosure, Joplin may or may not be in your Linux distro's repos, but there is an app image. So Joplin is pretty easy to install on any distro, because app images, of course, are distro agnostic. So you should be able to get Joplin installed on whatever distro you run using the app image. Joplin, though, was in the Arch user repository, the AUR, Full disclosure, though, the Arch user repository version of Joplin was broken in the AUR Joplin 1.0.104. This does not build correctly. It does not build correctly unless you install in Arch Node.js-LTS-Carbon. You need this package. This conflicts with the standard Node.js package. You need to remove that and install Node.js-LTS-Carbon, and then Joplin will build correctly for you. Of course, rather than having to fool with all of that, you probably should just use the app image. Getting back to Joplin here, this is Joplin here, opened up here in Manjaro. I took the time to install it. I even created a couple of notes. I created first note, second note. First note, you can see this is the markdown, so I could do some stuff like, I don't know, maybe make it bold. You can do some markdown, and this is how the note appears. This is the preview. So I could do bold, let's see, what else could I do? Could I italics? Yeah, italics and bold, that's cool. I could, of course, add links. I could add various markdown flags or tags, that is, attach a file. We could create lists, etc. All kinds of formatting options. And this is, where the code appears, and this is the preview. This is what the note will actually look like. We can create a new notebook. If I create a new notebook, I'll title it New Notebook. This is a new notebook where I can create new notes. So I had my first notebook, and that was New Notebook. So pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Again, I don't use these kind of note-taking applications very much, but Joplin seems very straightforward. Synchronize, so it does synchronize with various cloud syncing options out there, such as Dropbox, which looks like the example they give. I am a Dropbox user, but I am looking to get off Dropbox soon because they're dropping support for a lot of the Linux file systems out there. But for those of you that need to sync to something like Dropbox or Nextcloud or what have you, Joplin does sync with a lot of those services. So pretty cool app. I'm going to play around with it a little bit further in the future. It does interest me, especially since it is cross-platform. I could put Joplin on, of course, my Linux machines here, my Linux laptops, but also on my Android device. And if I have it synced with some kind of cloud syncing service, I have my notes everywhere. I take a note on my phone, and then I can pull it up here at the computer. That makes things really, really handy. So check it out, guys. Joplin, again, it's available as an app image. So regardless of distro, just go to the article. I'll link to the article in the show description. Click the download button here, and that should take you to the app image. And as always, I'm going to end tonight, with a viewer question or comment. Again, taking into account, this is Taking Into Account episode 6. We release Taking Into Account every Thursday. This is a weekly show. I release it sometime every Thursday, every week. So, a viewer submitted question. So over on Mastodon, I got this question. Hey Derek, I wanted to switch from MX Linux to an Arch-based distro. I was looking at Arch, but I'm not a fan of systemd, so I considered installing Artix. I've been running Arch for a month on a VM, so I thought Artix wouldn't be too hard to master after all, but what I'm actually scared of is the stability of the distro itself, as it was a release a year ago. So what do you think about Artix Linux? So, good question. You're looking to move from MX Linux, which is based on Debian stable, to an Arch-based distro, which is, of course, not stable at all. It's a rolling release distro, very bleeding edge. Not only that, you're not even wanting to run mainline Arch, which is pretty stable, and uses systemd as it's a knit system. You say you're not a fan of systemd, so you want to install something like Artix, which is Arch-based without systemd. They're using some other init system. I think they're using OpenRC. Anyway, you are right in being concerned. The Artix has not had a release in a while. I pulled up the Artix Linux page over here at DistroWatch, and the last release of Artix was January 5th of 2018. So, that's 9 months ago. That is very, very, very old for a rolling release distro. You could try to install it. It may work for you. I would try it in a VM first, or an extra hard drive if you got, an extra drive to play around with. But don't be surprised if a 9-month-old rolling release image does not install properly. So much has changed in the Linux world in 9 months, especially on a rolling release. It probably won't work out for you. For an Arch-based system that doesn't use systemd, the only other distribution I know that does that is Archbang. I've used Archbang in the past before. It's actually a really nice distro. I'm not sure if they have a recent image or not. Their last release was... let's see. Let me go to... I'm going to have to go to their SourceForge page and look at their images. If I go to Files here... Yeah, Arctic System, or Archbang Systemd, and Arcticbang OpenRC. So this is based on Arctics. And you see that this ISO is May 7th. So that's pretty good. That's 5 months younger. It's still an old ISO, but that's 5 months younger than than Arctics itself. And Archbang OpenRC is based on Arctics. So you might try that distribution. I do kind of have a concern. You're wanting to switch from Debian stable based MX to Arch based whatever, and I'm not sure why this init system matters that much for you. You say you're not a fan of systemd. Yeah, I mean, most people don't really do much with the init system anyway. I'm not sure why the init system should matter that much to you, but if it does, Arctics, that ISO is pretty old. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, try Archbang based on Arctics. That ISO is a little bit fresher. Other than that, if you want a rolling release distro, a bleeding edge rolling release distro that does not use systemd, you could try Gentoo, but I would definitely recommend you doing a few Gentoo installs in a VM before trying it on real hardware. Gentoo will be a much steeper learning curve than even Arch, but definitely a much steeper learning curve than MX Linux, which is very new, user-friendly. So just something to think about there. And that was, of course, episode 6 of Taking Into Account. So 5 stories plus the user comment that I read. I hope you guys have been enjoying this series, Taking Into Account. I have enjoyed making these every week. This is a nice change of pace for me. I hope it's a nice change of pace for you guys. Anyway, before I go, I do have to do a special thanks to all my patrons, all my Patreon supporters, and I'm talking about A.K. Alan, Alex, Hanson, Tony, Bart, Benjamin, Ben, Bruno, Brian, Carlos, Christian, Chuck, Dan, the other Dan, Daniel, David, the other David, Dirk, Eduardo, Greg, Humate, Interceptor, Jake, John, Carl, Katrina, Keith, Leor, Marcus, the other Marcus, Matt, Mateo, Mark, Martin, Matthias, Michael, Mr. GFY, Mr. Smarty Pants, Mr. Neely, Pops, Paul, Rob, Robert, Ron, Silvio, First Stephen, Second Stephen, Third Stephen, Swami, Tina Moon, Voice Live, Dubella, and John. You guys rock. You guys help make this show possible. Peace, guys.